Welcome to the Crypto Layer HQ. Today we will be going over Bitcoin and its performance versus silver, gold, and the S&P. We can see the S&P continues to have this distribution pattern over the last few months, started around October 2025. We've been essentially going sideways. Today we had a significant red day, potentially a rejection, and further continuation of distribution. So we could eventually see a pullback in the S&P, but the S&P has still been outperforming Bitcoin since it's been holding steady at these highs. We can see Bitcoin is definitely underperforming, and if we compare Bitcoin to the S&P, we can see that the S&P is clearly outperforming Bitcoin, and we are starting to reach levels where we might end up bouncing from. For example, around here, I think could be an interesting level to watch, since last cycle that could be the equivalent of where we bounced here, since we can see last cycle in 2018, 2019, we ended up making a top around here, and also it was a pretty significant level in early 2018, and then that's where we end up bottoming against the S&P. So potentially this time we get something similar where Bitcoin ends up bottoming against the S&P around this level. If not, potentially it will go lower and we will even revisit this level down here. I do think that there is a good chance we end up somewhere in between here. Maybe not at the lower level and maybe not at the upper level, but somewhere in between is very likely. Bitcoin versus gold is pretty interesting since we are reaching a pretty critical level. We can see we are about 28%, 29% away from reaching this low. So it's going to be very interesting to see if we end up getting a bounce. But we can see Bitcoin has been severely underperforming against gold since June of 2024. So that's about up to today, 436 days. So that's definitely a significant amount of time. If we look last time where Bitcoin topped against gold, 436 days out already took us to the bottom. So we can see this time that gold is outperforming Bitcoin for a longer period of time. I do think there is a good chance that we end up testing this lower level. If we take a look at Bitcoin versus silver, we can see we've already touched this lower level here where we bottomed back in December 2022, silver versus Bitcoin. And we might end up retesting this level and potentially consolidating for some time and maybe not even going much lower, since if we also look at gold versus silver, we can see that we did reach this lower level where gold was undervalued against silver, and now potentially gold will start to show strength against silver. So this is also telling us, since gold might end up being stronger against silver, there is a good chance that gold versus Bitcoin will still end up testing this lower level, while Bitcoin versus silver might end up bottoming here, since gold will have more strength than silver. That doesn't mean you should start rotating silver into Bitcoin or gold into Bitcoin, but that's potentially a signal to convert some silver into gold, since gold will potentially outperform silver, mainly looking at this chart where we can see whenever we reach this lower band, we end up eventually bouncing from it and reaching this upper band where silver is then undervalued against gold. I would use Bitcoin versus gold and Bitcoin versus silver more of an indicator of relative strength and when it could potentially be time to start to enter Bitcoin. For example, once gold reaches this lower level against Bitcoin, that could potentially be a time to start to get interested in converting potentially some gold into Bitcoin. So for now, I would say converting silver into gold could potentially be a good place to be. And then eventually, once gold versus Bitcoin reaches this lower band level, then it could be a time to start to convert Bitcoin into gold, assuming that we get to this level later this year, potentially in Q4 of 2026. But even earlier, it could be a good time to start to slowly convert some gold into Bitcoin, assuming you do have gold in your portfolio. We can also have a look at MSTR versus metals. So for example, MSTR versus gold, we can see it's also in a very deep correction from the top wick. We are essentially down 88%, and we could end up testing these lows. So that would still be a 65% drop against gold. And if we take a look at MSTR versus silver, we can see also we're testing these lower levels potentially, and that would be another 50% drop against silver. We can also compare MSTR to Bitcoin itself, and we can see they are, of course, very correlated, but definitely MSTR has had weakness against Bitcoin, and it has come back down to these levels where we might end up testing this lower region here. So it is important to keep an eye on how money is flowing and seeing how Bitcoin versus gold is behaving, as well as Bitcoin versus silver, and even Bitcoin versus the S&P, especially since the S&P is now in this distribution pattern, and we might end up getting a pullback in Q2 or Q3, and maybe even in Q4 of 2026. It'll be interesting to see if Bitcoin ends up finding relative strength or weakness versus the S&P. When that starts to happen, we can see Bitcoin's been pretty weak for the last few days now, and it's back at a pretty critical level where if we end up breaking this support, we might end up start to visit the 200-week simple moving average, which is a very critical level. Potentially we end up visiting that level early March or end of February, and then maybe in March we end up getting a bounce from the 200-week simple moving average, and then people will potentially say, okay, we visited the 200-week simple moving average, so we're gonna, now the low is in, we're gonna end up getting some strength. But usually when everyone's calling that the low is in, that probably isn't when the low actually is in. So I would wait to see what happens to that bounce. My base case would be that we end up rejecting, so we might end up getting something like this where we test the 200-week simple moving average, maybe get a bounce, which ends up getting rejected, and then we could end up fading and getting some more time-based capitulation later in the year. So I think right now it's very important to keep an eye on the S&P, see how it behaves, as well as gold and silver, since I think those are very good indicators for how the overall markets are behaving, since right now there's definitely a lot of uncertainty in 2026, and we might end up having some corrections in the S&P, and if we do end up getting some corrections in gold as well, that could end up resulting in further drawdown for Bitcoin as well.